Hello, class. Mr. Andrews here with some answers for the questions. There weren't a whole lot of questions, which I guess I'll take as a sign that in many ways the instructions were very thorough for you all. But there were three really meaningful questions that I wanted to answer, a couple of which had a lot of likes on them. So I'm going to go ahead and go through the three questions and just answer them in turn here. So we'll start with the very first question that I had on the list, which was, can panel members ask questions outside of those listed in each section? Or will they stick to those listed? Great question. And the answer is yes and no. So let me explain. When it comes to AP, you will be submitting this POD, or rather, I will be submitting this POD to AP for your score via a video file. So we'll be actually recording this, whether it takes place on Zoom or in person. For all of you, it will be on Zoom. So that Zoom session is going to be recorded, and the actual video recording of that will be sent to AP for evaluation. Now, the thing to know is that AP evaluates your presentation only based on the questions from that sheet. So in other words, once the questions get asked from those three sections, the recording will stop. I will actually stop recording and I will tell you we're done recording, but then I'll ask the panel, or even myself, we'll ask additional questions if we'd like to. But at that point, the additional questions that go beyond the list are simply for our own curiosity and understanding. You won't be graded or evaluated based on your answers. So in a way, it's kind of nice because you get to chit chat about your research, but once the recording stops, you're off the record, so to speak. You're not really being graded anymore. The panel's just simply asking questions that they are personally curious about. So the answer is yes and no. Yes, they can ask questions, but no, you won't be evaluated based on those questions. The second question that you guys had was, how strict will the timing limit for the presentation be? And I would say in terms of AP, you do want to stick within the time that is prescribed, because there are so many presentations that they have to evaluate. They have these guidelines for a reason. And so, yes, you do want to make sure that your presentation falls within the time limits prescribed, because you do really want to show that you've rehearsed it, that you polished it, and that you're able to both fill the amount of time they've asked for, but also been able to keep your thoughts limited to the amount of time that they've mentioned. Because part of the skills being presented here too is your ability to communicate your research in a meaningful way, but in a very concise way, to say it briefly, but meaningfully. So to go over the time limit would actually potentially work against you with your AP score if it were egregious enough, to be honest. Have I had students who did well who went over the time limit or who had a shorter presentation? Yes, I have. But there have also been students where the timing of their presentation did work against them. So I would do your best to rehearse and make sure that your presentation falls consistently within that time limit. The last question you guys had were, are there any guidelines on how your oral defense responses will be evaluated? Great question. And it actually pertains to something I'm going to be sharing in the next class session. The next class sessions, we're going to begin planning and actually creating our visuals, and we're going to look at the rubric. The rubric includes both grading criteria for the presentation, but also grading criteria for the oral defense questions as well. I will be presenting that next time, but I'll give you a quick preview. This is the part of the rubric that concerns your oral defense. And as you can see, there's 3 lines. Each line concerns a question, or rather your answer from each of those 3 questions you'll be asked, okay? The top one here has to do with that first group of questions. And as you can see, you can score a 1, 2, or even a 0. A 0 would just be you just don't answer the question at all. I mean, you'd pretty much have to just be quiet or insult us to get a 0. That's hardly possible. What is more possible is that you could get a 1. Now, you would get a 1 if you, say, identified your inquiry choice to the response in response to the question posed, but your explanation was superficial or illogical. What that simply means is if you're asked the question and you're talking and you're clearly trying to answer the question, but you don't quite have a clear, detailed, or specific answer to the question, you're going to get a 1, right? You're fudging it, you're vague, you seem unprepared. That's a 1. A number 2, however, is when someone is able to logically explain the choices you made during your inquiry process and how they were appropriate. If you're able to, for example, if you're asked a question about your process and you're able to connect it back to the research goals you mentioned before, if you're able to explain your choices or your thoughts or your steps in terms of the larger question or research goals you had, and you're consistently connecting it to that, you're going to get a 2. So what it really comes down to for all 3 questions is, are you connecting your answers back to what was just presented to us? Are you clearly connecting it back to your goals for research, for the question itself? And is everything you're saying purposeful and connected to your purposes as a researcher? Because if it seems clear that you're either fudging it or you just really weren't quite sure or you really hadn't thought it through, that's going to end up being a 1. And of course, if you're just silent and flip as the bird, you'll get a 0. But I would hope you would do neither of those things. So that's some answers to your questions. I hope that was somewhat helpful to you guys. Today, as you may have figured out, is more or less just an echo of yesterday, continuing to complete your research or draft your findings and analysis section. And of course, if you're in a position of doing it, maybe even beginning to think about outlining your POD based on the outline you saw in the instructions. That said, next class we will actually be meeting live so that we can talk over Zoom about POD, and we can do a little workshopping with our own organization and visuals for it. We're going to start planning those things next time. So plan on being up and at 'em by 8:45 on your next gold day next week, and I will see you then. I'm looking forward to it. More info to come.